Today we're going to be analyzing a book called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technetronic Age by Zbigniew Brzezinski. This is one of the first books when I went down the conspiracy theory, quote-unquote, rabbit hole. This is one of the first pieces of documentation that I went back to start reading it for myself, to see what did these people say, what were they openly admitting to, what was going on in the government. So just as a little, before I get into it, and I'm going to be analyzing it as I read it. It's not just going to be a straight reading. I will try to limit my comments as much as possible, but there's going to be a lot as we read between the lines. But let's do a little bit of background on Zbigniew Brzezinski. Who's Zbigniew Brzezinski? You may have heard this name thrown around by the media, not really known who he is. He's sort of in the background. So he's known as Zbig. Like, what is this name, by the way, Zbigniew Brzezinski? Is this really his name? I don't know. He was a Polish-American diplomat and political scientist. He served as a counselor to Lyndon B. Johnson from 1966 to 1968. So he's worked directly with presidents Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter as a national security advisor from 1977 to 1971. This is more the time of when this book was written. It was in the 70s, late 70s. As a scholar, Brzezinski belonged to the realist school of international relations, standing in the geopolitical tradition of Alfred Mackinder. See, these are things you can look up as well that connect and will give you more backstory. We're not going to delve into them right now. While elements of liberal idealism, what does that even mean? Interesting. Liberal idealism in the foreign policy context was that a nation-state should make its internal political philosophy the goal of its conduct and rhetoric in international affairs. For example, an idealist might believe that ending poverty at home should be coupled with tackling poverty. Interesting. Okay. So it's collectivism. It's connecting your morality and idealism with the government and imagining that you are the whole country and that your country should do things on your behalf. That makes sense. That ties in with a lot of what he talks about. It's different forms of communism, collectivism, slavery. I mean, government is all those things. Brzezinski was the primary organizer of the Trilateral Commission. Okay, now I was going to get into that some too. I don't know if that's mentioned in the book, but that's one of the big NGOs that sort of runs the world, runs the governments behind the scenes, the Trilateral Commission and the Institute on International Affairs, I believe is what they're called. I'm forgetting what the other one's called. But anyway, all right. Also, the book we're reading, Between Two Ages, I wanted to have a physical copy to read. It's hard to come by. It's out of print. It's like $400. This is a bid. I tried to do a bid the other day, and it just kept bidding every time I bite it. But yeah, you'll find out this isn't the same book. $77 new. Okay, that's not terrible. I don't have money to blow on that. So I'm going to be reading from a PDF so soon. Let's get a little more background here. These guys are great. Richard Grove, he did a podcast called 9/11 Synchronicity, and then he went on to do Peace Revolution podcast, which is really great, and now he's doing this podcast, which is called Grand Theft World. But they're great because they break down what's going on in the news with history. As you can see here, he's got books. He goes back to sources, and he's a great source for you. Listen through his podcast and you can write down books and things to go get and look up and do your own research. It's not, you don't just take it at face value. And that's what I hope I'm going to influence people to do, is research things, read these things. The texts are out there. It is an open conspiracy. I mean, I'm sure you guys know H.G. Wells. He wrote classic science fiction like War of the Worlds. He was a member of these societies, and he has a book called The Open Conspiracy, where they're openly telling you we want to run the world because we think we have the best ideas. and this is how we're going to manipulate people. This is how we're going to control society. And Brzezinski was in there with these guys. So let's do a little bit of background. I have 2 clips. The first one's shorter, the second one's a little longer. And then we're going to jump into reading Zbigniew Brzezinski's book. So here's a little backgrounder on Brzezinski.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, who we're about to talk about here, this big stack of books. Let me cut back there. Big stack of books. Zbigniew Brzezinski, he was a reader of Anthony Sutton's work. He was. Anthony Sutton was working at the Hoover Institute. That's a subsidiary of Stanford University at the time. Also the same source as Casual View of America that we talked about. I'm dropping books now. Casual View of America, also Stanford University. You might want to get yourself some of these academic books that are so much not talked about in public. Brzezinski, he understood what Anthony Sutton was pointing out, insofar as the United States wasn't just battling communism, it was funding communism in order to battle it. And then when you dig down beyond, like the Brzezinski, he discloses through his books, you would see that there is an international source of funding capitalism and socialism and communism, all for the purpose of what? Not aggrandizing human capacities and unlimited freedom for individuals so long as it doesn't infringe on other individuals. No, that would be too swell a place to live. No, what they seek to do is divide and conquer people by loaning out money for people to do things that are kind of deleterious to other people's freedom, like a slave trade. That's exactly what Sutton was saying right there. He was saying this isn't the first time in history it's happened. Sutton in 1973 says Lysander Spooner in the 1800s had already observed this, and it continues to go on.
So those are some important connections to make there between, the slave trade, also government is quite literally slavery. Let's jump to the next step. There's more here.
This side with David and Zbigniew. Oh, Zbigniew Brzezinski is the biggest anti-communist you've ever met. He's pushing it hard this way, but it also justifies.
Oh, that was the other thing I was going to say, is that's the Hegelian dialect, is you control both sides to get a reaction that you want out of the populace. You cause a problem, then you control the reaction to that problem, how people respond to it, what they say they want. You manipulate them into wanting something from that problem, and then you offer that solution which you had pre-prepared, that you were walking people down that path. That's the Hegelian dialectic, and that's what happens on a grand scale with these wars and conflicts and isms, these communism, fascism. They're all just ways to obfuscate the truth that there's a grand control that's happening that wants you to be afraid and manipulated and accept their solution to these problems.
Is working with Al-Qaeda, who was a proxy army created by British intelligence. British intelligence started grooming the Arabs in World War I. It continued through the 1920s. They created the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they continued to cultivate fascist Arab Nazis, which they sold off as an intelligence unit to Allen Dulles in the CIA. This all precedes Zbigniew Brzezinski coming on the scene. And once Brzezinski gets on the scene and the Cold War is a hip-hop, and he's from Poland, he's got an anti-communist bent. David Rockefeller recognizes the brilliant young student at Harvard University, Columbia University, all these universities that the upper crust, as Ray, anyway, the upper crust universities is where he's coming from. Now, Francis Boyle, who we've talked about, he's the professor from University of Illinois, Champlain. He's a law professor. He went to school with Kissinger and Brzezinski in the same program. He graduated with Robert Rubin, who's another famous kind of politico that still has a grasp on power these days. So Boyle was able to tell us, he's like, hey, these guys in this international affairs, they're pushing from both sides. They have players on both sides, the right and the left. They use them both to squeeze freedom out of the picture. So it's like this. And the more you play into these mechanisms that they've set up on either side, the more it's going to crack freedom like a nut. So the key is, let's all stop taking actions in these events which we're not educated in. Let's start to maybe become educated before we take further actions, because if not, it seems like the mentality of the crowd is leading very much toward confrontation, toward all sorts of new laws and restrictions. You know, there was a time, I think John Stuart Mill talks about it in On Liberty, but there's a time about several decades after the American Revolution where they leave Britain. It's called the Terror. It's a time of great restrictions on civil liberties and individual rights in the name of the empire just having lost its jewel that it so much appreciated, because those people figured out freedom and became separate from the monarchical rule. So that type of history has prevailed. People lived through it, suffered through it, died through it. We don't need to repeat these historical events again.
Exactly. We don't need to relive the past. We can slow down. We don't need to react. We can learn and we can grow. And that's what this process is to learn about how we got here, how this government came to be, why do people believe in a government, why do people think it's good, why do people want to vote and participate in it. It is people like Zbigniew Brzezinski that insert these ideas into people, not even to where they're conscious of it, but it just permeates the culture, it permeates the media, it permeates the entertainment, the news, the social media. And you're going to see this book was written in the 70s, and he's going to describe for you the internet age that we live in. America's role in the Technetronic age. What were they talking about in the 70s? The Technetronic age. Testing 1 2 1 2. Alrighty. So this is kind of an experiment for me. I've been dabbling in Twitch the past few weeks and playing a lot of video games. But my original passion was to like share knowledge, share these books and history and things that would be called conspiracy theories. But it's an open conspiracy. It's a plan that's out in the open. They write books about it. They talk about it publicly, but most people, they don't know the history because it's been hidden from them. And it does seem boring on the surface if you don't take the time to dive in. So that's what we're going to do today is, this is actually part 4 of my reading of Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Role in the Technetronic Age. I like to cut these up, make them, you know, more palatable because it is a long form reading of a book. So the stream is going to get edited and re-uploaded on YouTube. But if you want to join along, if you want to chat with me, I've got chat going on both YouTube and Twitch as an experiment. And we'll see if anyone joins. You know, it's an obscure topic, and you know, I don't have that many subscribers, and obviously most of them know me from playing video games, but I find this stuff incredibly fascinating, and you'll see it over and over in all kinds of media, including video games and film. But I'm currently playing Mega Man, and I got to the end of Mega Man Legends, and the boss in Mega Man Legends is talking about wiping out the carbons and the population. So hey, I see Matt in the chat. Yeah, you don't know me from video games. This is right. Most people probably on here actually just know me as a friend, like Matt. But yeah, I'm going to read through some of this, see how far I get, and just as a test. Hey, and Matt, if you want, I don't know if you know my YouTube channel, but check that out too. I'm streaming both on Twitch and YouTube, so I'm seeing how this works as a test. I figured this would be a good test because I'm not playing a game, so it's not going to tax my system as much. I'm just reading PDF, so we'll see how this goes. Let's see, I'm trying to pause my stream on my phone. All right, let's see. Part 2, the age of volatile belief. And I know that some of this stuff seems dry. I'm going to struggle with some of the language, as I always do. I edit that out in post, but you're going to get to see me mess up these words. But what they're talking about is kind of mind-blowing when you piece it together with what this was written in the 70s, and they're describing things that really only started existing today, like influencers and the way social media would function and the way technology is manipulating society. All right, let's jump in. So the age of volatile belief is intimately linked with the impact of the Technetronic revolution on existing ideologies and outlooks on life. What man thinks is closely related to what man experiences. The relationship between the two is not causal, but interacting. Experience affects thought, and thought conditions the interpretation of experience. Today, the dominant pattern seems increasingly to be that of highly individualistic, look at these words, individualistic, unstructured, changing perspectives. Institutionalized beliefs, the result of the merger of ideas and institutions, no longer appear to many as vital and relevant, while the skepticism that has contributed so heavily to the undermining of institutionalized beliefs now clashes with the new emphasis on passion and involvement. The result for many is an era of fads, of rapidly shifting beliefs, with emotions providing for some the unifying cement previously supplied by institutions, and with the faded revolutionary slogans of the past providing the needed inspiration for facing an altogether different future. And that ties in heavily with, this was written in the 70s when people really started to stop believing in government and these big institutions and religion. And everyone started getting compartmentalized into these smaller groups, very reactionary groups. Like you see all the protests going on today and the way people, their emotions are leading them. They don't really understand what is going on a deeper level, but they're pissed off about it and they're going to go protest and burn down some buildings. And of course, that's by design, where they manipulate your feelings and opinions. They want you to lose faith in these bigger structures so that they can come in and give you new beliefs. And that's what he's going to go over in this book. Several broad phases can be discerned in the formation of the collective human consciousness that conditions our response to reality and provides the framework for intellectually structuring that reality. The great religions of recorded history were crucial in establishing a perspective that linked man's individual preoccupation with his inner life to a universal God, who is the source of a standard of behavior binding upon all. Reality was God-given, and the line between the finite and the infinite was blurred. The ideological phase associated with industrialization and the spread of literacy involved a much higher propensity towards social activism and emphasized more immediate goals as defined either in terms of the nation or some other collective good, the external condition of man being the primary focus. Activism called for a more explicit definition of our reality, and systematic, even dogmatic intellectual frameworks were meant to meet that need. In our time, the established ideologies are coming under attack because their institutionalized character, which was once useful in mobilizing the relatively uneducated masses, has become an impediment to intellectual adaptation, while their concern with the external qualities of life is increasingly felt to ignore the inner, more spiritual dimension. Commitment to individual action based on moral indignations and stimulated by a much higher level of general education has become a substitute for highly organized activity, though it avoids the passivity and indifference to external reality that was characteristic of the pre-ideological age. A lot of that is really important to think about too, just how what your preconceived notions about how the world works or about how you fit into it are going to change how you perceive what's going on and how you interpret that data. So he's talking about the things that had held society together for hundreds or thousands of years were breaking down, and people are starting to see themselves and how they fit into the world in completely different ways. Compelling ideologies, thus, are giving way to compulsive ideas, but without the eschatology that characterized other historical eras. Yet there is still a felt need for a synthesis that can define the meaning and the historical thrusts of our times. In that search, the dominating passion is equality among men within institutions, within societies, among races, and among nations. Equality motivates both the rebels in the universities in the West and the East, and the new nations in their struggle against the better established and richer ones. This emphasis, as well as the fear of personal obsolescence, AI, anyone? Causes concern in many that the new post-industrial age will require even greater differentiation in skills, competences, and intellectual preparation, thereby widening the disparities within the human condition at a time of ever-intensifying global interaction. Yeah, what did he say there? Yeah, the equality thing is huge because, I mean, that's kind of so much of our society has lost its faith in God and religion, myself included. I'm an atheist and I don't really believe in God anymore. So the God for a lot of people, it was government, obviously, but also this idea of equality, which isn't a real thing in the way that we think of it. Like, we're made to think that everyone should just be equal, but people are different. Everyone's different. No, to be actually equal, the only way to do that would be if everyone was a slave and everyone was forced to be weaker and everyone was forced to be identical. Like, if people are actually free to be individuals and be themselves, then there's going to be differences. Like, it's just fun. Like, it's a difference between equality of outcomes or equality of this is the part I would edit out. But equality of outcome versus equality of real equality would be you're free to do what you want. But if you have equality of outcome and the outcomes are all the same, then you don't really have freedom to be yourself and to do what you want to do. The quest for universal vision. Man came silently into the world, but though his coming is shrouded in mystery, in the sense that we still know little about the actual beginnings of human existence, from earliest known history, man is given evidence of an intense yearning to understand himself and his environment. However crudely and primitively, man has always sought to crystallize some organizing principle that would, by creating order out of chaos, relate him to the universe and help define his place in it. Despite the disappearance in earlier times of entire cultures, human evolution or social development has involved both an expansion in man's awareness of himself and his fellows as a human entity endowed with certain common qualities, and an increasingly systematic intellectual effort to define and organize his external reality meaningfully. There has thus been at work what Teilhard de Chardin has called an augmentation of consciousness, a stream whereby a continuing and transmissible tradition of reflection is established and allowed to increase. That just brings up, they use the word stream, and I'm literally streaming this out, but how, like in the show Black Mirror, they say screens are a mirror to ourselves. That's the metaphor there. And it's the internet has become the ultimate mirror of ourselves and what we mean in the world and how we relate to it. Let me jump in the chat here. Hey, Matt. Did that work? I don't know. I don't know if that sent. Oh, yeah, there it goes. Yeah, I've got it set up where I can see both chats over here combined, the Twitch and the YouTube. Not that there's much chatting going on, but I'm figuring out how this stuff works. All right. In terms of the entirety of human existence, that stream may indeed be a short one, as the critics of the notion of historical progress readily point out. Nevertheless, recorded history does provide strong evidence of growth, often halting and uneven, but growth nonetheless in man's consciousness of a common human fate, of certain universal cravings, and of a common moral standard. Even when they compete, religions and ideologies have increasingly done so in terms of and for the sake of principles that seem, when viewed from a historical perspective, more and more to involve semantic and not substantive differences. This is not to deny that practice has often widely differed. It is, however, remarkable that conflicts have been waged over competitive claims to a superior interpretation and application of such universal values as democracy, welfare, individual dignity, and personal freedom. When how many of our modern wars that the US government gets into is to spread democracy all over the world, or to spread welfare or freedom to these other countries that we then bomb to hell and blow them up. Like, oh, look how free Iraq is now, or look how free Afghanistan is now. Like, how much democracy did we spread? No, we spread bombs and we call it democracy. The universal religions. The crucial breakthrough in the development of human self-awareness on a mass scale came with the great religions, the first universal synthesis that simultaneously expanded man's vision, both vertically and horizontally. Vertically, to define in extended and complex terms man's relationship to a God that was not a small group's alone, but everyone's. Horizontally, to articulate a series of imperatives that govern man's obligation to man on the grounds that all shared the divine spark. Universalism thus emerged as a state of mind even at a time when man was still provincial and isolated in mutually exclusive social cultural compartments. Whew, this is some tense, heavy language to get through. Accordingly, the birth of the universal religions represents the appearance of humanity qua humanity, the assertion of man's equality before God in terms of his spirit, his conscience, his soul, laid the basis for the transcendental importance of the human being and for the much later assertion of the equality of men in their political and social dimensions. In that sense, proselytizing Christianity, which universalized the more limited Greek and Judaic tradition, was a particularly revolutionary force and was viewed as such by established authority, in spite of the distinction it made between equality before God and obeisance to Caesar in Caesar's terms. If human history can be said to involve both a struggle and an evolution toward the progressive liberation of man, then the attainment of equality before the supernatural was the first major step on that road. It makes me think, too, of how government has evolved over time just based on how people viewed themselves in the world, like we were talking about earlier. Before, all governments used to claim that they were God. Literally, I'm Caesar or I guess Pharaoh back in the day would say, I am literally God on earth. Like, that's why you should obey me. That's why these laws matter. And over time, as people developed and understood themselves more in the world, that stopped making as much sense. So then the governments would say, oh, well, I'm not actually God, literally, but I represent God, and God wants me to be your king and your ruler. And then eventually over time, that didn't work as well. So they had to come up with the idea of democracy. Well, actually, I don't get my power from God. I get my power from you, the people. You see, the people, they give me power. When you vote, that's why I have the right to rule over you. And now even that's starting to break down, but you still see people defending democracy as if that is their holy religion. Like, yes, these people do have the right to rule me because I voted. And you see, that's what makes it good and moral. Like, no, that's just another religion. That's just another way for you to pretend that these people have special rights that they don't actually have, because no one has the right to rule over you. And no one is the actual God on earth. They're not ordained by God. And all that not being true, us voting for them doesn't actually give them magical powers to rule over us either, even though that makes more sense to people these days. Drink break. This will be cut. But early man could neither control nor comprehend either himself or his environment. Both were essentially a mystery, a given to be accepted, whatever the pains of life might be. As a consequence, the distant future became a much more intense object of preoccupation than the immediate present. The inability to cope effectively with disease, plagues, infant mortality, a short lifespan, or natural disasters such as floods, crops, blights, prompted man to seek refuge in all-encompassing definitions of his reality. These in turn provided at least partial justification for the view that human endeavor was futile and for the necessity of accepting events with fatalism. By taking refuge in an autonomous, distant, divine future, man relieved himself of the obligation to struggle intensely with the present under circumstances he was neither intellectually nor practically prepared for. In the same way that people today will not fix their own problems, but they'll vote for those problems and say, well, I don't know how to solve this problem, but I'll just tell the government to do it and they'll do it for me. In the same way people say, well, I can't solve this, but God will solve it, or when I get to heaven, then it'll be solved. Even the notion of free will, a central component of the most activist of the great religions, Christianity, basically involved an inner act of conscience necessary for the state of grace, rather than a point of departure from morally motivated external action. No stress was placed on the struggle to improve external conditions because the unstated assumption was that they could not be fundamentally improved. The emphasis was on the inner man. By riveting his attention on the universal and the divine future, man could master the present by simply ignoring it. Minimum social action was matched by maximum commitment to the supernatural. To meet the central need of their time, mainly to provide man with a firm mooring in a world which could not be comprehended, and to assert firm control over man's spirit, religious beliefs crystallized into dogmas and were organized into institutions. The more individually demanding the religion, the higher was the degree of institutionalization. This has prompted the analogies made by a number of scholars between Islam and Christianity on the one hand and communism on the other. With this institutionalization came more activism, the Crusades and the holy wars of Islam, and the exercise of muscle by religious organizations on their environment. Power was asserted, however, to extend the conquest of the spirit, not to effect social change. The institutionalization of belief thus combined two functions. It was the zealot's self-defense mechanism against a non-believing environment, and it was a tool for sustained proselytization, one designed not only to win over adherents, but to overcome the inertial resistance of the masses, who were largely indifferent to the spiritual requirements. And of course, those institutions don't really go away. Like, even though most people don't believe in God and Christ, and that being why we should follow government, those same beliefs lived on and evolved and just changed form into things called democracy or voting or these sorts of things. Although Christianity has been the most activist of the great religions and has thereby laid the basis for the subsequent secular revolutionary movements that have dominated Western history, the process of institutionalization, that'd be a good drinking game. Whenever I say institutionalization, you take a drink. And hence the emergence on the part of organized religion of a stake in the status quo has tended to mute radical message in the Christian concept of history, the movement towards salvation on earth as in heaven. Thus, in practice, the Christian churches have gradually come to accept social stratification and even to benefit from it, as in Latin America. And some Lutheran varieties have even come to sanction in dogma concepts of racial inequality that are extreme variants with the initial egalitarian revolution represented by the new Christian relationship between God and man. The other great religions have been more passive, both in practice and in theory. Buddhism does not contain imperatives for social change, but offers salvation from reality. Unlike Christianity, nirvana did not serve as a springboard for temporal activism. Similarly, Islam's dominant strain of fatalism has worked against the presence of at least that element of tension between eternal peace and heaven on earth that is so strong in Christianity and that has prompted its repressed activism. It makes you wonder, too, if that's why governments latched on to Christianity, like the Roman Empire becoming the Holy Roman Empire, because it knew it could use those ideologies to spread its own power and its own control. The national identity. With the growth in the West of man's ability to master his environment, secular rationalism, accompanied by a greater awareness of social complexity, as well as by a breakdown in the existing structure of religious allegiance, emerged to challenge institutionalized religion. That religious allegiance simultaneously rested on the narrowness and on the universalism of man's horizons. The narrowness derived from massive ignorance, illiteracy, and a vision confined to the immediate environment by limited communications. The universalism was provided by the acceptance of the idea that man's destiny is essentially in God's hands, and that the limited present is but a stepping stone to an unlimited future. Emerging secularism challenged both dimensions, and in so doing required for the external projection of man's identity an intermediary focus of loyalty, something in between the immediate and the infinite. The nation state and nationalism were the responses. And there are good things that came from Christianity in that way. The universalizing of morality is legitimate. Like that's why it's wrong to own other people, because it's universalized that all men own themselves and so can't be owned by another man except by force and violence. So like universalizing these things, morality is a good thing, but then it's used in these institutions to universalize doing evil. So the doctrine of sovereignty created the institutional basis for challenging the secular authority of established religion, and this challenge in turn paved the way for the emergence of the abstract conception of the nation state. Sovereignty vested in the people instead of sovereignty vested in the king was the consummation of the process which, in the 2 centuries preceding the French and American revolutions, radically altered the structure of authority in the West and prepared the ground for a new dominant concept of reality. The nation state became simultaneously the embodiment of personal commitments and the point of departure for analyzing reality. Wow. This development marked a new phase in man's political consciousness. And that's, wow, there's a lot packed in that. But that's like what I was saying, how authority used to be vested in the king, who before that was even believed to be a god. But now it's funny because the power is still vested in the king. They just make you believe that you have the power because you vote, as if it really matters which king you put into power. No, you're the one in power. Like it's not me doing it. It's not me going to war. It's not me taking your money through taxes. It's you the people. You're the ones doing it. Like it's completely ridiculous on its face if you think about it. But because we're forced to go through thousands of hours of public school where we're told that this is good and normal, you can't even see it. Like a fish in water, you can't even tell that it's there. Nationalism did not seek to direct the individual toward the infinite, but to activate the impersonal masses for the sake of immediately proximate goals. Paradoxically, these concrete goals were derived from the still intangible and transcendental, though new, object of worship, the nation. The nation became the source of ecstatic, lyrical affection, and it was this highly emotional relationship, symbolized by the new anthems, flags, and heroes, that served to energize the populace. The concrete goals took the form of massive preoccupation with frontiers and erudita brethren to be regained from foreign captivity, and more generally, the power and the glory of the state as the formal expression of the nation. The state thus became the institutional form for the new dominant belief, with a monopolistic claim on the active dedication to it of man, now designated first and above all as the citizen. Right, and that's when people started to think of themselves as the citizen, as part of government. That became their religion. The designation, man the citizen, symbolically marks another milestone in the evolution of man as a social being. Equality before God was now matched by equality before the law. Spiritual egalitarianism was now reinforced by legal egalitarianism. It is of note that legal equality was asserted both by the American Revolution, which supplemented its stress on equality before the law with a strong attachment to religious values. Indeed, it derived the former from the latter. and by the French Revolution, which constructed its pantheon of human equality by explicitly rejecting the religious tradition. In both cases, the legal equality of the citizens was postulated as a universal principle. Thus, it marked another giant step in the progressive redefinition of man's nature and place in the world. And that equality before the law has become in the modern day just equality, period, as if everyone should be equal. The original idea was that we would all be treated equally before the law and no one would get preferential treatment. You would all be treated as the same for committing a crime, or for instance, for committing a crime. But now the idea is that everyone should just be equal. So the outcome should just be equal, where we should all make the same money, have the same things, have the same outcomes. With nationalism, where did I skip ahead? No, with nationalism, the distinction between the inner contemplative's man concerned with his relationship to God and the external man concerned with shaping his environment became blurred. Nationalism as an ideology was more activist. Man's relations to man were objectivized externally by legal norms and were not dependent, as was man's relation to God, on personal conscience. Yet at the same time, the definition of man as a national was based largely on abstract, historically determined, and highly emotional criteria. This outlook involved considerable vagueness and even irrationality when used as a conceptual framework within which relations between nations and developments within nations might be understood. Nationalism only partially increased man's self-awareness. It mobilized them actively, but failed to challenge their critical faculties. It was more a mass vehicle for human passion fantasizing than a conceptual framework that made it possible to dissect and then deliberately reassemble our reality. And that's important to think about too. Our nations are completely abstract ideas. Like the fact that this plot of land means that we are all the same. It's like saying, it's like in reality a tree exists. The forest doesn't actually exist. It's just a bunch of individual trees. But in our minds, we imagine the forest existing when a bunch of trees are all together. In the same way, a nation or a government in that way doesn't actually exist in reality. It only exists in our minds as a concept combining other things that do exist in reality. Ideological universalism. That is why Marxism represents a further vital and creative stage in the maturing of man's universal vision. Marxism is simultaneously a victory of the external, active man over the inner, passive man, and a victory of reason over belief. And this is intense propaganda right here. It stresses man's capacity to shape his material destiny, finite and defined as man's only reality, and it postulates the absolute capacity of man to truly understand his reality as a point of departure for his active endeavors to shape it. Wow. That was like a load of nonsense. To a greater extent than any previous mode of political thinking, Marxism puts a premium on the systematic and rigorous examination of material reality and on guides to action derived from that examination. Though it may be argued that this intellectual, that doesn't make sense on its face because of what I was just saying. Like, Marxism is the idea that everything is owned by everyone. But that's just an abstraction. Like, only individuals can own things, like only individual trees can exist. The forest can't own anything. Only the individual can actually own and take possession of something. To imagine that everyone can own something is a complete abstraction that only exists in the mind. Though it may be argued that this intellectually rigorous method was eventually subverted by its strong component of dogmatic belief, Marxism did expand a popular self-awareness by awakening the masses to an intense preoccupation with social equality and by providing them with both a historical and a moral justification for insisting upon it. More than that, Marxism represented in its time the most advanced and systematic method for analyzing the dynamic of social development, for categorizing it, and for extrapolating from it certain principles concerning social behavior. It did so in a manner that lent itself to translation into highly simplified principles that provided even the relatively uneducated with the feeling that their understanding of phenomena had been basically sharpened, basically, and that their resentments, frustrations, and vague aspirations could be channeled into historically meaningful action, right? The government would just do it for you. Because of this, Marxism appealed simultaneously to man's ethical, rational, and Promethean instincts. The ethical component, sustained by man's emotions, drew on the Judeo-Christian heritage. The rational responded to man's increased desire to comprehend the dynamic of his material environment more systematically. And the Promethean stood for man's faith in his powers, for the notion that history is made by the people, and that nothing can hem in their advance to perfection. Right, that doesn't sound like a cult at all. In this sense, Marxism has served as a mechanism of human progress. Even if its practice has often fallen short of its ideals, Teilhard of Chardin notes at one point that, monstrous as it is not modern totalitarianism really the distortion of something magnificent, and thus quite near to the truth? If your hero is saying that totalitarianism was just so close to being perfect, it's so close to being the truth and something beautiful, I think you're on the wrong track. Like, no, people being the slaves of an authoritarian ruler is not magnificent. Elsewhere, he observes that all the peoples to remain human or to become more so, how do you become more human in that way, are inexorably led to formulate the hopes and problems of the modern earth in the very same terms in which the West has formulated them. What he does not say is that for many outside the immediate influence of the West and its Christian tradition, it has been Marxism that has served to stir the mind and to mobilize human energies purposefully. And of course, most of Marxism on a large scale was promoted by the West and other countries. It wasn't a natural thing that spread on its own. Moreover, Marxism has decisively contributed to the political institutionalization and systemization of the deliberate effort to define the nature of our era and of man's relationship to history at any given stage in that history. Emphasis on this question has compelled reflection on the relative importance of different forces of change, the weighing of alternative historical interpretations, and at least the attempt at tentative judgment. Moreover, it has provoked a series of subordinate questions, all helpful in forcing recognition of change and in compelling adjustment to it. Within the given era, what particular phases can be deciphered? Is it any given phase one of international tension, of greater stability, of shifting locale of conflict, of a new set of alliances? Who are our present principal foes, subjectively and objectively, who are now our allies? What are the sources of principal, secondary, and tertiary dangers? Periodic, formal, purposeful examination of such questions compels systematic probing of the international scene. Yeah, and an honest answer of these questions would be these elite rich people who run the government and most corporations are our enemies and are not our allies. And they're the ones trying to get us all to think that these other people are our enemies, and that we need to fight them either with wars or using government to throw them in prison and these sorts of things. Periodic, formal, purposeful examination of such questions compels systematic probing of the international scene. Or just look at who's ruling you. Really, you don't need to look internationally, just look at your own government. This is not to say that contemporary communists have always been successful in accurately perceiving the meaning of new international phenomenon. Indeed, their conviction that their analytical tools provide a faultless guide to their inner meaning of things has often led them astray. Unwilling to accept the notion of the relativity and elusiveness of truth, they have elevated their inescapably partial insights into absolute dogmas and reduced complex issues to gross oversimplifications. Nonetheless, to define communism, the institutionalized expression of Marxism, primarily as a disease of the transition from traditional to modern status, or to assert that Marxism is in fact nothing but an epiphenomenon of technical development, a phase of the painful marriage of man and technique, is to neglect what will probably remain the major contribution of Marxism, its revolutionary and broadening influence, which opened man's mind to previously ignored perspectives and dramatized previously neglected concerns. To say as much is not to ignore the subsequently enslaving effect of institutionalized Marxism. Yeah, I mean, we know that Marxism enslaved people, but I'm just here praising how amazing it is, especially when in power, or its analytical inability to cope with the problems of the advanced 20th century world. It is to assert that in the gradual evolution of man's universal vision, Marxism represents as important and progressive a stage as the appearance of nationalism and of the great religions. In all three cases, religion, nationalism, and Marxism, the breakthrough had many antecedents and did not suddenly come about as the result of an entirely autonomous act of creative genius. No, it came from somewhere. Marx capitalized on the intellectual achievements of his immediate predecessors, for some of whom socialism had a strong religious basis. Similarly, I can't say that word. Similarly, internationalism and the great religions were the articulate synthesis of moods, of attitudes, and of a certain social receptivity that had matured over a long period of time. Also, in all three cases, the breakthrough in perception was followed by perversion in practice, religious wars and the Inquisition, national hatreds expressed in unprecedented mass slaughter, brutal terror, purges, and totalitarian subjugation of the mind as well as the body in the name of a humanist ideology. Nevertheless, in all three cases, the intellectual horizons of man, once widened, could not again be narrowed. Equality before a universal God and the emphasis on individual conscience, equality before the law, and a commitment to a social entity larger than the immediate one, social equality, and a concern for analytically dissecting the dynamic thrust of history all have cumulatively helped to farine and enlarge man's political and social consciousness. Given the dominant role of the activist West in shaping the outlook of our times, now in the second half of the 20th century, almost everyone, often without knowing it, is to some extent a Christian, a nationalist, and a Marxist. He's 100% right there, I gotta say. There's a lot in that last sentence. I mean, just to break that down a little bit, most of our morality comes from Christianity. So even atheists still hold a lot of Christian values. And everyone thinks of themselves as their country, as like a tribe. Even people that would be like, oh, I hate nationalism, or nationalists are evil because they've associated that with totalitarianism. Everyone still thinks of themselves as part of this group, this country, this landmass. And most people are very Marxist because they believe that the government should be funding all these things to take care of us, to give us schools, to fund social programs. I mean, that is Marxism, basically, that everyone's money is everyone's money. So it morally justifies government taking your money to give it to other people, redistribution of wealth. Because if everything's owned by everyone, then it doesn't matter if I steal your property. Hold on one second. It's getting dry in here and my throat is getting super dry. Let me see how much further until a good breaking point. Organized Christianity. Let's see. Just under an hour. Let's go a little bit further. Let's see how far I can get before my throat gives out. I probably shouldn't be drinking coffee. I should be drinking water. Two, turbulence within institutionalized beliefs. It is increasingly difficult for institutions to assert dogmatically the pristine purity of the doctrines that they claim to embody. You know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and pause here. Yep. I'm going to start here at this section next time. This has been a fun test, though, of the streaming capabilities. And I'll be streaming a game next, so I think people will enjoy that more in general. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, those that did. And for those that watch this later, please subscribe to my YouTube or go check me out on Twitch, The Logical Shaman, in both places. I'm going to be playing a lot of video games, and I'm going to continue to do more works like this that help educate and bring to light some of these things that should be more known but are still secret even though they're out there in the public. All right, thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks for tuning in. Bye.